And because we have such an incredible panel, I'm going to keep my comments very brief. We've talked about and really, what animates Black geographies in practice and pedagogy, and I really, suggest folks, to take a look at the conversation that we had last month, which will be airing on Africa Will Now Project in the coming weeks. But I want us to think really clearly about the centrality and the struggle for land in Black geographic imaginations and spatial practices and African indigenous knowledge systems and the African world and the diaspora. The centrality of land gives not only meaning and is inextricable to the necessities of life and balanced living, the locations of African history, Africana history, selfhood, identity, power, resistance, and healing. Land is then also a set of relationships and a system of knowledge, a way of thinking and knowing the world, understanding and naming the external and internal world. When we think about collective land and the struggle for collective land and what it supports and makes possible, it's also part of this process of decolonization, this long struggle to imagine or reimagine the spaces and places that we're living based on. And what we really see with the Rural African Women's Assembly is based on regenerative African indigenous knowledge systems, which is part of this ongoing decolonial project. And I think about some of our comrades in the African world or in the continent. So I'm thinking about particularly a Kenyan retriever and bearer of Africana cultures and histories, an environmental activist, Wangui Wakamoji, who reminds us that Africana collective land-based struggles really articulate a regenerative framework for governance, for justice, for spirituality, for economics, for education, and for old and new Africana communities that are defined in accordance with a holistic reality of African worlds or Africana worlds as societies, ecologies, and spirits that are in relationship. So what I would like to do is really invite our panelists to share some of their opening remarks and reflections on the film. And as I said before, this is a cipher. So anyone I'm more than happy for people to tap in to really enliven and illustrate really the human, spiritual, material, and social realities and these burgeoning contemporary and past even grassroots movements for justice, liberation, and radical social transformation. So anyone, I know Dr. Pope, Savi, don't be shy. Y'all are talkers, all of a sudden you're shy. Just kidding.
Well, yeah, I mean, Kurt, really, thank you for the film and the grounding that it offers us, and us in the diaspora can really see ourselves in this film. And so from the land loss prevention perspective and my entry to that organization, I spent a year in Zimbabwe in '95, walking that land and visiting villages and reading a lot and meeting some moyo and pimping some courses at the Agrarian Institute, meeting people and just getting mad as hell. I had never been so angry in all my life. And it was around just living in an African country in which 98% of all arable land and 96% of water rights were being held by 12,000 whites, settlers, and millions of Africans living in communal lands, which were like semi-arid. And then to add further insult to injury, the introduction of non-native trees to the region. And so you're being bombarded by settler colonialism, and then you're dealing with the transformation of the environment as a result of their presence. And just looking at these very tall trees that were just, oh, I gotta plug in my computer. Sorry, I think we're back up. The eucalyptus tree, and how they just root, they find the water. So they're like, they're just like the settlers, you know. They find the water and it's theirs, and villages are struggling to build homes and access to boreholes without even the technology. And it just really transformed my thinking. You know, I'm from Jamaica, I'm used to a lot of water, but at the same time, I've seen in my brief time there before immigrating to the US, the pollution of rivers from mining and how that has impacted the country in terms of the exploitation and the impact on public health. So the Zimbabwean situation then led me to come into the American South and dealing with Black farmers and their dispossession, and working for an organization, the North Carolina Association of Black Lawyers, that was founded on more radical civil rights principle. And they themselves were part of the group of lawyers who were very much interested in what was going on in Southern Africa and Africa in general in terms of the land question and how universal that land question is amongst us, and how that really situates everyone in the same boat, and with very similar histories and reaction and degradation of our environment. And so, you know, it comes full circle. Kurt, watching this film, was 95, and it's been a minute, and the beauty of the place still there, the struggle of the people, their energy, their voices, were really so familiar that I felt a longing to be back there. And so, you know, I feel that where we are with the planet and the environmental burden and the cumulative risk to public health and to our bodies, that I think coming out of this pandemic, things can't be the same anymore. And I think for Black folk, it has really internationalized the struggle once again around, it's not just about your civil rights, it's everybody's civil rights. And we have to find ways to come together to really defend our Pan-African existence and protection of our bodies and spirituality and Mother Earth. So yeah, I loved it. Thank you so much. I look forward to looking at some of your other pieces. Yeah, thank you. Dr. Tasneem?
No, thank you so much, Savi. I invite Yusuf and James to offer their opening remarks and reflections on the film, and particularly thinking about, you know, the ways in which legal mechanisms are being invoked as a way to actually, you know, to provide some sort of, you know, protection and preservation in land, but then looking at like the ways the film really reveals these complexities of land tenure and the complexities of these legal systems. So maybe we can disrupt some of that conversation if we want to think about how do we, you know, really materialize taking the land back that's not based on using the legal frameworks, the very legal frameworks that dispossess and displace us and remove us from the land and alienate us from the environment.
I'm gonna digress to Brother Youssef so he can go, and then I'll kind of piggyback because I got some rhymes in this cipher that I will share with everybody.
Oh, wow.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, James, and thank you, Tasneem, for the invitation, and thank you, Kurt, for really a fantastic film. I want to echo what Savi said. It's really an impressive work, and it offers so much for us to think about in terms of both contemporary struggles and contemporary forms of global capitalism that we're struggling against. So it's an honor to be here and be in conversation with all of you. I'll just offer, a few thoughts. For me, the film really, it does a lot of work, like I was saying, but it, in particular, I think helps push back against or potentially beyond some of our traditional kind of radical anti-imperialist or Pan-African models of struggle, at least, and it does this, I think, in at least 4 ways, in a productive sense, in the sense that it pushes us towards thinking. First is the documentary really centers the theme of settler colonialism, which is excellent. We're more used to thinking about settler colonialism either within the United States or within some of the more obvious settler colonies, former settler colonies, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. But it really centers the framework of settler colonialism for thinking about land and struggles around land today and its legacy. But what's interesting, I think, in this regards is that we get a sense of indigeneity as potentially conservative in Southern Africa, rather than just primarily progressive, as often is the case in indigenous struggles in Latin America today that we often turn to for inspiration. So that was one way in which I thought it kind of pushed back against some of our dominant understandings. Indigeneity is quite complex here. There's both indigenous land practices that the movements are drawing upon, but then there are the traditional authorities who have access to land. And in this sense, this points to a second problem, I think, that the documentary raises, which is the control of land and the rise of a Black elite. So we see here clearly that the structures of global white supremacy have not been dismantled, that many of the landowners remain white and multinationals, either coming from abroad to control land or local whites who were the settlers and have never left. We see that in a number of scenes throughout the film, but we also hear about the ways in which the descendants of traditional leaders, traditional authority figures, have managed to gain access to land and solidify access to land in the post-colonial moment as a part of a kind of distortive decolonization process, right? Kind of decolonization from above that further entrenches the traditional leadership structures that were really put in place under colonialism, right? So it's kind of a misnomer to call them traditional in that sense. So it's kind of a co-optation of decolonization that I think that the documentary really portrays quite nicely, but this does seem to represent a really significant entrenched power base in the rise of a Black elite in the form of these traditional authorities that these communities are often struggling against in their struggle for access to land. Third, I thought the documentary really pointed to the complex nature of globalization, really what we could call a kind of second phase of globalization. So if the first round of globalization in the 90s and the early 2000s was really about a struggle against what we called a neocolonialism, a persistence of the United States and European colonial powers now using the IMF and the World Bank to maintain their access to natural resources in the former colonies, but now with flag independence for those former colonies. Here we have a whole new range of actors, right, that have pushed beyond that first round of globalization. And this is why I think it's globalization 2.0. So, for example, Vedanta Resources, one of the central actors in Zambia, mining company, I looked it up. It appears to be an Indian company that began as a scrap metal dealer in Bombay in the 1970s. And by the early 2000s, with the rise of globalization and the increased dispersal of capital accumulating firms around the world, it had grown tremendously, and it required a majority stake in an Indian state aluminum business. Then it was listed on the London Stock Exchange in 2003, and it rapidly acquired additional companies. First, an Indian gold mining company in 2007, and then it bought assets from a then bankrupt American copper mining company based in Arizona in 2008. And I think that opened the door for it to copper mining, which it's what it's doing in Zambia. So it's really an Indian firm that has outcompeted, in a sense, American capital, buying assets from a bankrupt American firm from a prior era, and now really engaging in this really horrific form of extractive mining in Zambia and polluting the entire area, as the documentary points out. Alongside Vedanta being an Indian-controlled company, we have Pro Savannah in Mozambique. And here the actors are again Japan and Brazil, triangulating with Mozambique in the form of, development projects that the documentary argues and activists argue are really attempts to solidify land grabs. So although that project appears to have ended, the documentary tells us, in 2020, certainly these two examples point to the increasingly dispersed architecture of power that globalization 2.0, in a renewed scramble for Africa, whatever you want to call it, is, blurring the geopolitical lines of who we might be struggling against. Fourth, I thought the documentary really pushed us beyond the kind of male dominant narratives of struggle that we have inherited from the past, and it moves clearly to the centrality of women-led community movements. Land and social reproduction are really central here, rather than the factory necessarily and the wage. So rural livelihoods are really what are struggled over. But alongside that, we also get a focus on production, or rather kind of extraction and small scale mining at the community level towards the end of the documentary. And here we see issues of the persistence of child labor and the struggle for access to land to make a living through kind of small scale extractivism. So the changing nature of work in this context of landlessness, that's a long-standing issue, but now in a new context where kind of formal employment or the ability to live off the land is kind of brought increasingly into question, I thought was really important. And so I think it's not a surprise that, and it's really useful, I think, that the documentary highlights a lot of these women-led community movements. So those were four ways that I thought it kind of pushed back against some of our traditional narratives of what we're up against and what struggle's about. There were three more points I guess I would point to that I took away from the documentary. I'll try to be brief here. And I think this relates to some of what Tasneem was asking us about with regards to the legal structure as we can take recourse to it versus kind of movements. I think there were kind of competing visions of liberation that were on offer to us in the documentary, kind of a version of liberalism and a version of radicalism. And I don't know, I'd love to hear more. Kurt, maybe you can tell us more about some of these figures and their visions. For example, the Zambia Care for Nature and Sama Kearns seem to be suggesting that the land problem and the extractivist problem would be solved if everyone just used the resources, according to the law, as Tasneem indicated. Mm-hmm. She also implied that the kind of natural resources need to be extracted in order for the country to develop, to build schools. And in a sense, she's right. This is the perennial problem that governments, whether radical or liberal, face when they take power, right? The need to continue extracting natural resources. Certainly we've seen that in radical experiments in Latin America in order to pay for schools. But is that really what's happening? Is this developmental extractionism? And that's kind of what's the tension here. So I'm curious if she was implying something about the community small scale mining project that we saw in the clip right before her, or was she saying they were doing something illegal and that's hurting the nation? Does her group, Care of Nature, think that the environment should be preserved at the expense of people's livelihood? So I wanted to know more about the different perspectives and kind of class backgrounds of these actors. She also productively implied that the kind of corruption of politics, which I think is a theme that certainly resonates throughout the world in our moment, right? That We can't turn to existing political parties for a solution here. It's really movements outside the state that offer a significant alternative vision. And related to that, there was a kind of this competing visions of liberation. There was, this hint of community consultation in Mozambique. I can't remember if it was Flaida or Molina who was saying that, there should be a process of community consultation when these extractivist firms or these contentions over land control are really debated. But what does community consultation mean? And she implies that it's a really thin process. So is it state-led community consultation? Is it community-led? So we kind of get a sense of a neoliberal approach to democracy where people are viewed as through stakeholders versus the radical approach to democracy, which is really what I think the movements are embodying. So the last two themes, really briefly, were corruption of politics, as I already noted, just that people campaign for office in order to enrich themselves, regardless of their political orientation, apparently, to gain access to land. The absent representatives, right, at the state level, the MPs, or on the local community level, the ward development committees and councillors, they only show up at election time. This is a problem throughout the region and the world, arguably. So it points to this kind of post-political condition when you think of politics through the state again. But politics remains alive outside the state in the form of social movements. And last, obviously, the documentary really nicely highlights the repression of activists and the stakes of struggle. We've all debated this in the recent film Judas and the Black Messiah around Fred Hampton and the legacy of those struggles, the price that people paid for those struggles. And this strikes me as extremely important to remind us that in struggling merely for one's livelihood in rural areas throughout Southern Africa, really you pay a high price for taking on entrenched interests. So really enjoyed the documentary and looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
I guess everybody's looking at me. One of the things that I enjoy about being on panels, particularly in this particular group, is that it allows me to kind of sit back and learn and sit back and think intentionally and also deeply about the things that we all care about. And this is very, very important in the context of this question around land. And to kind of piggyback off of everything that Brother Yusuf just said, I think you got a camera in here, like looking at my notes, because my whole notepad is really literally, of dealing with those particular points. But I wanted to point what I think, and thank you, Kurt, for the work that you're doing, for the work that we're going to be doing, because there's so many different things. But I wanted to kind of encapsulate my comments in something I have been saying. In particular, whether I'm teaching, whether I'm doing things in the community, that there are two fundamental gifts of European modernity. And I say gifts with tongue in cheek because it's really not gifts, because we're actually sitting here talking about these things. And also Kurt is filming these things. Attorney Horn is dealing with these things in the context of land extraction and all this other stuff. But these two so-called gifts are the redefinition of what it means to be human that comes out of a European epistemological and historical context as a justification for private property, right? And so what I think, and Brother Yusuf, you can tell me if this is a little off, but the fundamental contradiction that I think that Kurt has showed in this film really is what we're all dealing with, this contestation between ownership of land and this Black commons, the idea that we do not own the land. But yet we're trying to do this all within this cyclical pattern of a racial capitalist structure that permeates our very being and lived experience on a day-to-day basis. And when we think about that, when we think about colonialism itself, it disrupts everything, not just the way that we think in the context of land itself, but it disrupts our thinking process. As Kwame Ture used to say, capitalism makes us think that we're thinking, right? And so these contradictions that we're dealing with are constantly rooting back to this idea of what it means to be human that was redefined as a justification for private property. So then the question becomes, for me, and Yusuf, I think you're absolutely correct. It's like all of these contradictions that Kurt has really brought out in this film of like, what are we actually struggling for? Specifically in the context of, are we trying to usurp the landowners, right? The so-called idea of what it means to own land in a colonial process, in any type of colonial, whether it's neo-colonial, old colonial, direct colonial. But I think that we really this reconceptualization of what we're doing and what we're fighting for becomes very, very important that you're alluding to, Yusuf. And I think Kurt does this in the film just brilliantly, just being able to just let the film kind of speak, let the people speak for themselves, which I think is very important because it allows us to be in community and thinking with folk who are actually dealing with these, whether they're trying to use law, whether they're trying to fight against it. So the question, I think, is a fundamental question that I think that we're all dealing with, that the folk who are getting evicted, the folk homes are being taken on a constant, they're dealing with it directly, right? We're all sitting here in our homes, right? Having a conversation, about something, that is happening here in the United States, as Attorney Horn knows, right?
Yes.
Kurt knows this, right? So I don't know. I don't have too many answers, so to speak. It's more like a conversation, and I think is important, but it's a conversation that I think that needs to be had in consultation with the folk on the ground who are struggling, who are dealing with this. And like, this notion of racial capitalism, which I also, as a point that I'll add to Yusuf's, how many points you had? Yusuf, about 10, 11 points. I'll put 11 up here, put 12 up here, is that what it does is it shows how deeply racial capitalism has permeated the very existence of what it means to be human, whether you're in an African city, whether you're in a United States city, or whether you're out in the so-called bush, or you're out on the outskirts. It permeates, and I think that we're dealing with those on a day-to-day basis. We all are dealing with them. What does it mean? What does it mean to struggle for land? What does it mean in ownership? Which is a very, very interesting question, because if we have an African indigenous knowledge system that says that we do not own the land, what are we actually trying to do when we're trying to struggle for land in this particular case? So I just wanted to say that I'm shut up right now and let Kurt, because Kurt, we set this task for you, set the terms of engagement for you, and hopefully, and I see people up here that look very familiar. Please, by all means, jump on in this conversation as well.
Yeah, really, James, you're so right, because I'm looking at what's going on in our own land struggles here, and coming off the recently passed federal law around Black, Indigenous, people of color, farmers, and looking at how it's structured somewhat around the Homestead Act, which is like one of the most, it was a complete taking of Native American land, and led to genocidal wars in the taking of it. And so for us to be looking at re-entering the new Black agrarian movement on land that is so contested is very problematic. And in the midst of Native Americans wanting to rematriate their land, they want it back, and for us to continue to walk that line on how we view property. And so I think it's some work around that us in the Black land space will have to grapple with. And I think this film informs that. What is this about property that we feel such a strong affinity for, and why is the privatization and ownership of it you know, the thing that we desire the most. And it just can't be.
I mean, this is so generative, and I want to invite Kurt into the conversation as well, because, you know, you've laid out just really the contours and the contradictions and complexities of the struggles that we're waging. And I would love for you to actually really pick up and respond to some of these questions that Yusuf and James and Savi had laid out, because, you know, this is, you know, I was thinking about, and one of my questions kind of for you was thinking about how you became involved with the Rural Women's Assembly in Southern Africa, which was constituted about a decade ago. And it, you know, we look at Eswatini and Mozambique and Zambia, but it covers over 9 countries. And it has maintained its sort of local grassroots, focused on women in rural areas, focused on poor African women, small farmers. And so if you can lay out some of these competing visions that of freedom that we see, and we're, you know, watching those sort of play out, and thinking about the ways too, why it's so important. I mean, all of us are really grounded and centered in community-centered work. Even the way in which we teach our classes, it's always about community to community engagement, right? And the types of research questions and the types of intellectual work that we do stems from these questions that we're coming from our own communities, and then working with communities, you know, in this larger global conversation and global solidarity movements, to think about, you know, what are we really struggling for, right? When we're thinking about radical social transformation, it's not about the reproduction of private property. It's not about the reproduction of a racial capitalist society. It's about thinking about a world, right, that doesn't require any of those systems or structures. So please, I'm gonna stop.
Yeah, thank you so much. Firstly, for showing the film, showing my work, and thank you so much for all the panelists for your input. It's really encouraging and inspiring, because I think, you know, a lot of times as an artist, you know, you sit in your corner, you create, you know, your idea, and you go out and make it, and then, you know, you offer it, you know, you make it as an offering to society, and I hope, you know, with the idea of inspiring people as well, you know, as you're creating art. Yeah, I mean, myself, you know, I'm from a settler colony known as South Africa. And more specifically, I grew up in Cape Town, which represents the epitome of the settler colonial project, right? And so, you know, one is that, you know, I mean, this narrative and the story around the land question is a very personal one to me. One is, you know, both my mom and dad, you know, their families were dispossessed from their land, you know, during construction of South Africa as a republic, pre-1910. The 1930 Land Act, obviously, you know, was critical with Black families losing land permanently. And so my mother's side, you know, they grew up, you know, in the rural part of the Western Cape, with where, you know, wine farms are basically the kind of main, one of the main kind of contributor towards the GDP in South Africa, the wine exports. And so you have this history of plantocracy that's been going on, you know, with the inception of slavery in South Africa, and more specifically in the Western Cape. So, and then obviously with, you know, the establishment of apartheid, 1948, there was the introduction to the Group Areas Act, right? And so again, my mother and my father, you know, their families were dispossessed again, like second, third time, right? So, you know, I inherit this long history of people who've been dispossessed from land. And obviously I know just from a historical perspective, 1652, right, was obviously when the bomb was dropped in South Africa. And this is obviously in, you know, direct correlation to my own, you know, ancestral history and story with the dispossession of land, dispossession of people's identity, language, culture, a disruption of you know, their society. So, you know, having created and been dealing with the issue around land reform, it's, you know, it's something that, you know, obviously in terms of, as you know, I also, prior to making films, I was also involved with activism work, grassroots activism. Specifically where I'm from a township on the Cape Flats. So yeah, I mean, the intersectionality of struggles, of social movements, you know, it's basically been my political schooling. And I started really dealing and touching on and really trying to understand this idea of, you know, what does the healing process and the restoration of memory mean if one kind of reimagines the idea around liberation, right? And this is directly correlated to the land question, right? And so, you know, having, you know, made a number of films around, you know, the land question, I, you know, was involved with the Rural Women's various different organizations, and having, you know, made films, advocacy work, using film specifically as an activist tool, and, you know, like facilitating various workshops with rural women, teaching them how to document their own story. These are all kind of been, I guess, a creation of a pedagogy that I've been thinking about and thinking through as I'm working in Africa and traveling around the world and working with the broader African diaspora as well. And just seeing these correlations, right? You know, working in, you know, the South, you know, I, at some point, Dr. Sive, I was actually working with some local farmers actually in New Orleans, and just like moving between South Africa or the continent of Africa and the US, I just saw all these correlations. So I think what I'm trying to do really in my work is to kind of, one is to create solidarity, right? Kind of Pan-African solidarity, using film as a vehicle for transnational solidarity at the same time. Because there's just so many correlations, right, with the indigenous struggles here, struggle of Black America, and just the broader, I mean, discourse around people of color and people who've experienced colonization, right? And the trauma thereof, and intergenerational trauma of that process. I think the land question is integral to the ideas around how do we think through the ideas around liberation, right? And I think coming to also to the idea around, you know, this, I think Dr. Joseph was really fascinating, made an interesting point around the second 2.0 form of the neoliberal project, right? Around how these, you know, so-called kings and queens, you know, have co-opted themselves within this capitalist project, right? And so now you have the idea, I mean, the discourse around how people who are working the land, you know, have to basically still fight, you know, but it comes back to, I think even Dr. Pope spoke, you know, so eloquently about this idea of, you know, the philosophical question around, or the moral question about this idea of ownership, right? And I grapple with myself, and I think just working, you know, with various movements in different parts of the world, that we are really custodians, right, of the land, you know, and we have to preserve, right? And it was really, I think, the inception of global capitalism and enforced through white supremacy, right? That a price tag was attached to the ownership of land, right? And we've co-opted, we bought into that project. So how do we undo that? How do we decolonize that process, that thinking, and then reimagine a kind of nuance, a new zeitgeist moment, right? And I think obviously we right now figuring out what's that new zeitgeist moment. I mean, we're dealing with a global pandemic. And so there's kind of interesting equal footing, right? So it's almost like there's a buffer zone now to think through, reimagining the idea around liberation and decolonizing the ideas that we've been schooled, right? You know, through a capitalist, you know, system, and we've bought into it. So for me, the real critical question is also the idea around the nation state, right? You know, what does it mean, you know, for citizenship, for belonging, and also that's linked to the idea of land, right? And farming the land, working the land, and feeding yourself and your family and community, and exchanging as well, right? The idea of, you know, because, you know, there's a famous song by Burning Spear, social living is the best, right? You know, so for me, that's you know, ideally what I'm trying to do in my work is to show that, you know, this idea around socialism and community engagement and community sharing of ideas as a critical way of thinking through decolonizing, the question around decolonization.
I see Dr. Rashid is in the house. And so I was like, did you want to make it? I mean, when you turned on your camera, so you looked like you wanted to say something. So let me give you the opportunity if you would love to tap in into this cipher. I want to give you the opportunity to do so.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I turned the camera on because I teaching on Zoom, you see the black squares and it's really demoralizing. So I really hate the idea. I don't like talking to black squares. I figure other people don't like it either. So, but just to, I really appreciated the film. I didn't get to see all of it because I was running from a meeting to this, but I appreciated, it was a couple of things that stood out to me. And one of them was something that Yusuf mentioned that I really appreciated, is that these dual conceptions of futurity. And this is the thing about why I really appreciate the film so much, Kurt, because there are these notions of futurity implicit in economic, within policy, as well as implicit in terms of the types of campaigns that people embrace. And so on one hand, you have this neoliberal future that people are striving for, and this other still defined conception of the future grounded in notions of communalism. And that is particularly intriguing to me. And one of the things that it makes me think about, it reminds me a lot of some of the things that we're dealing with locally here in Chicago. So my wife and I have an urban farm on the southeast side of Chicago. And on one hand, we have a city administration that positions itself, and at least in terms of a lot of the language, as being very progressive. So if you think about a lot of the discourse that came up a few years ago around police reform and the killing of Laquan McDonald, on one hand, you had the administration positioning itself as being very progressive, but on the other hand, you have the administration, especially over the last 12 months, take some moves that are very indicative of a posture of maintaining the existing white supremacist system. And this has also been, the complexities of this are compounded with respect to land, because on one hand, you have these people who are urban farmers who see the land as something which is not just something that gives people food, but as an anchor of cultural memory, an anchor of historical memory, a glue of the formation and the reformation of community. But then you have this other consciousness, this other worldview, this other paradigm that sees land as a commodity. And these, I don't want to say they're irreconcilable realities. I'm not going to say that right now, but these are two very distinct ways of seeing and being in the world. And the thing that it makes me ponder is what does this look like in terms of movements? Because the thing that Kurt mentioned, and I think maybe Yusuf and James mentioned it also, is this question of struggle. Like, I think generations prior to ours, I think, had very clearly delineated pathways of struggle that they were engaged in, right? In terms of how they conceptualized the decolonial struggle, or how they conceptualized the struggle against, white supremacy and civil rights within this settler colony that we live in. But we live in this very strange space where what is often articulated as freedom is actually a reinscription of the neo-colonial system. And so, like, for me, it's always this question of what are the paths forward, recognizing that is necessary to avoid oversimplified representations of what that type of politics should be. But at the same time, there has to be an anchor which grounds this work and compels this work going forward. So it generated questions, something that I need to ponder, but I definitely appreciate any insights you all could lend with respect to that. And Savi, I definitely appreciate what you said about the land, because these are conversations that my wife and I are constantly having about land and land access, and how the state apparatus is often a barrier to people's actualizing the right to self-determination, which people are doing innately all the time, and they are constantly warred upon by the state. So I'll stop with that.
And I want to open it up to anyone that wants to respond to each other as well too. Please feel free to do so. I did have a question. I kind of wanted actually Yusuf to kind of bring in some of the work that he's been doing, especially around this shack dwellers movement, and to think about, we have the case study of the rural Southern African Women's Assembly, but also thinking about, the motivating factor around the shack dwellers movement and how they're mobilizing and how they're organizing each other in informal settlements and for what purpose, and how we can think about these as part of this larger sort of like landscape that's of these various movements that are interconnected in Southern Africa, that also reveal these sort of complexities and contradictions, but help us try to think about a path forward to futurity that's not about, reproducing a racial capitalist society, but is constantly thinking and moving us towards, this communalism, a community, and it can be sometimes it's informed by communism, sometimes it's informed by socialism, but it's rooted in a much more sort of ancient tradition of caring and stewarding for each other and the land and nature.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, of course, I was thinking about South Africa and the shack dwellers as I was watching this. That moment in the film where the woman is talking about how the counselors are absent, the ward counselors are absent, except on election day. I mean, that could have been an exact description of the kind of critique of local ANC officials in South Africa. Certainly on the part of the shack dwellers movement, they make the exact same denunciations, the same denunciations of corruption within the state in terms of how they take advantage of purportedly developmentalist policies like the distribution of houses in order to further entrench their control in only ANC supporting communities. So the kind of commodifying of supposedly developmentalist assets that the state provides for poor people. The other thing that I think was so useful in thinking about the shack dwellers in Durban is that the shack dwellers offer us a kind of urban side of this story that Kurt was saying he also coming out of Cape Town, right? That the struggle around land, we tend to view it purely as a rural issue. And, that rural urban divide has historically been quite problematized. We know the history of the kind of circular migration patterns that the apartheid system really relied upon. And that's continued up into the present. And one of the interesting things about it is this kind of scrambling of that urban-rural divide today. But the struggle for land is certainly just as much an urban struggle as it is a rural struggle, I think, in these different countries. The other thing that I think resonated was, and I think Kurt was gesturing to this, talking about Pan-Africanism and the desperate need to revive Pan-Africanism in this current moment, particularly if you view this issue from the South African vantage point, where we've seen this horrific rise in xenophobic attacks against these very same countries, right? Migrants from these same countries, from Mozambique, from Eswatini, within South Africa. Now there's a way in which the state has produced a xenophobic kind of anti-African discourse, as though Africa's out there, not in South Africa. And so the need to understand these interconnected struggles, exactly what the film does, and to do so by taking us to places that are much less traveled, right? Zambia, Mozambique, and Eswatini, so important. And to show the kinds of conditions of landlessness which generate the exact same of international cross-border migration that shack dwellers in Durban have also endured, whether it's from rural KwaZulu-Natal into urban South Africa. So I think that it really generates the possibility of solidarity in thinking of struggles across national boundaries, and thinking of much more global architecture of power that we're up against, rather than the kind of short-sighted attack on national governments as the end-all be-all, because of the patterns and the similarities that we see between these different movements. So those were some of the resonances I saw, certainly, Tasneem, between struggles in Durban and South Africa that I know Kurt is even more familiar with than I am, and what the stories he told in the film. I was just so appreciative that he brought in these kind of even more marginalized geographies to draw out those connections.
And Dr. Pope, I wanted, so we're talking about Pan-Africanism, and, we're thinking about, African Indigenous, it's something that we use a lot too, is thinking about African Indigenous knowledge systems. And I was thinking maybe you could talk about this relationship. I was on a call early this past week, and, thinking about the organizing of Amazon workers in Bessemer, Alabama, and the importance of Black internationalism. Someone made a comment that Black internationalism is the only thing that's going to save us, right? And so thinking about, Black internationalism, Pan-Africanism, and then also, African Indigenous knowledge systems. We pay a lot of, and something that Yusuf had pointed out really rightly is, like, we pay a lot of lip service to African Indigenous knowledge system and implementing that, and thinking about that this is a pathway forward in terms of creating these sort of restorative and regenerative frameworks, and thinking about alternative modes of socialization and design, right? So colonialism is all about design, right? Spatial design, and social design too. But can you kind of like think about those in relationship to each other, and how they help us develop the sort of conceptual framework in terms of the types of spatial practices or material practices that we engage in when we're organizing, when we're mobilizing communities, when we're doing the work of political education. And these sites that Kurt has looked at both of his films are really these sites of where critical consciousness is taking root, and then also these sites where, organizing and mobilization are happening.
Okay. And I think after I answer this question, we have figured it out and we could go out and do this work, right? So, but I'm trying to, I'm really trying to shift my mind because I was doing like two different things before jumping on this. No, that's a great question. I think that we all have bits and pieces of it, right? I think that we have talked about it. To talk about land and to talk about the long genealogy of the importance of land being related to African indigenous knowledge systems, of course, this is the stuff, the things that African people, the people on the African continent who was snatched, brought with them was that particular knowledge. And what I mean is that something that Dr. Rashid talked about, something that Kurt said that he's doing that I think actually can help us understand this question that you laid out. And they said something, in the context of the restoration of memory and understanding that our memory is related directly to our land because the land was something that gave us identity, it gave us place, it rooted us, not only in relation to other people, but again, understanding to be the caretakers of nature, but also how that is in a spiritual sense related to us understanding our place in the universe. Right. Mm-hmm. And so the systems within which understandings that, African people brought with them and then created other ways of being through the forced travels or routes, whether it was in, Latin America, Central America, here in the United States or Europe, though that knowledge, that system, that sense of rootedness, that sense of understanding that one takes source from the land. Right. I'm looking here, we have our colleague Moise Mutali, who I say is an undercover agronomist, right? We talk about Amilcar Cabral. We talk about, when we look at how this genealogy of land and how important it was, you can look at the Pan-African Congresses, look at the demands of the Pan-African Congresses. One of the first demands was land, right? Being able to and what they said was, give us the land and leave us alone. You know what I mean? So, that's a very important understanding in the context of also this question of land. We're also talking about the entire earth within which is being hurt by racial capitalism. We are all connected to this ancestrally, historically. We're clear about this, but also something that Kurt was saying about his work and Dr. Rashid just talked about this notion of solidarity. And I wanted to make sure that we understand that this notion of solidarity and resistance precedes and extends into and beyond a European praxis of an imposition of that nation state, which is also very, very informative of this whole question of what we're talking about, right? This whole question of land, the nation state, the imposition of these structures that separate people, that separate people not only from that ancestral and indigeneity that Brother Youssef talked about and that Kurt is really trying to show in the context of his work, but really talks about it. And for me, it's that memory. That's where the space is. Because I remember I was saying earlier, where do we look and how do we reconceptualize? We really have to, the restoration of that memory in relation to understanding that while land, as Malcolm used to say, is at the center of every struggle. Even Europe itself, as it was discovering itself, what they were fighting over, land, right? In their own little small space. And they transported that across the world. So again, how do we kind of reconceptualize and really get down to like the fundamental? A lot of people don't like to talk about philosophy, but we're all philosophers, just like we're all artists and creatives as well. But we really have to understand and think about the way that we think about the work that we do and be okay with understanding and dealing with those contradictions. And I think that also, creates the space for that solidarity to be understood in the context of as you aptly put, a communalism, which is an ancient practice that you can get through to socialism and communism as those governance structures, but a communalism is a total encompassing of an all, right? It's a government structure, it's a cultural structure, it's an artistic structure, it's a language structure. It's something that precedes and extends into, right? And kind of, really informs, even folk that think about socialism or folk that think about communism, because at the center of that is that African indigenous knowledge system that was also transported, around the world, which is also the thing that European modernity was also fighting, right? So, so when we think about it in that particular, I'll probably confuse everybody a little bit more, but I'll just go ahead and, kind of throw this out to the panel. But, that restoration of memory and understanding that our memory is directly related to the spaces and the places within which we draw that rootedness, that substance, which is an ancient idea that we practice on a day-to-day basis. We even talk about it, growing up in the cities, we talk about our communities, our hoods, right? We throw up our sets, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? So that relationship is very deep, right? And we display it in interesting ways, but it's still there. Look at those spaces. Look at those spaces in between spaces.
I wanted to bring it back to Kurt and to think about, and more of it in a practical way in terms of how we're thinking about these sites of memory, right? And this restoration of memory. And I remember from our last conversation, the work that you are doing with the collective around, creating these archives with the work, especially these archives around spatial violence, thinking about documentary film as a a process of archiving and of documenting our stories. And so thinking about this project, and I know in some of our conversations, and I hope it's okay that I mention this, you're also looking at the Marikana massacre as well too, right? So thinking about this project, particularly around land, but also do you have plans to expand on this project? I remember Not in Our Neighborhood started out, and correct me if I'm wrong, like a 5-minute film, and then it moved to a 45-minute film, and then it sort of became like this feature-length documentary. What are your plans for this work? Are you thinking about, developing a public humanities project? And this is something, and I asked too, because this is something that I think about, I mean, in a similar way, like my ancestry is the experience of multiple dispossessions and displacement from land, right? And coming from both sides of my family, from South Asia, and from the continent, who are farmers and teachers. And I'm also thinking about one of the largest social movements, and arguably in our history, around farming and farm agricultural workers in India. And so, thinking about how we can, I know La Via Campesina has been doing this work of bringing, peasant farmers together around the world, particularly in the global South, but also thinking about maybe public humanities projects or archival work that you're doing to document not only these various land struggles, but also ways in which we can, collaborate, that we can come together and share strategies and share practices and share understanding about how we fight these legal systems, right? About the types of forms of social organization that we are doing, right? But also pushing more for those types of formations to really take root and to exist for much longer than, sort of fleeting moments.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Tasneem. Having been thinking through a body of work that speaks about land memory, restoration of memory, healing. I know through the journey of my previous film, Not in My Neighborhood, which was showcased last month, obviously the film kind of, delves and goes deeply into this, the history of colonial spatial planning, right? And in its correlation to legalized state violence and spatial violence, right? And I think Dr. Joseph pointed out a very critical point, this idea of building solidarity also between like the rural-urban struggles as well, right? Because it tends to, live in silos, right? And I think my mission, I would say, is to bridge that, right? And And so through our collective, Azania Rising, we've made a conscious effort to make sure that, for example, we started thinking through an archival project that looks at the history and the contemporary impact of the homeland systems, right? It was created by the apartheid system, and documenting and going back to these former homelands, right? As we all know, it was like independent states, right, within the geographical territory of South Africa. And it's interesting because it also speaks directly to the identity politics that South Africa is still trying to articulate this idea of what does it mean to be a South African. I mean, people have clearly decided that that the mythology of Desmond Tutu's a well-known saying of the Great Rainbow Nation, call it aka South Africa. I think through the 2015 that bubble was burst through the student uprisings, at the Rhodes Must Fall movement. That spoke about the history of colonization, the history of colonial architecture, colonial iconography. That's still bombarded us in South Africa. I think across the world, because we've seen when that movement kind of came, we saw the international solidarity, right, with like Oxford University, the BLM movement in the US. So organically, these kind of global transnational solidarity just organically manifests itself, And now with, obviously power through the internet and using, the camera, to document these stories, I think it's an exciting moment as well for myself who think through my work as, as an activist, right? And thinking about reform, political reform, right? And so, and I think, and I just wanted to actually add to Dr. Joseph, what he was talking about, the struggles in KZN and in Durban, and maybe think about the legacy of the Ngonyama Trust, right? Which was, basically the foundation of that is through the late, rest in peace, rest in power, rather, King Goodwill Zwelithini, where, there's right now South Africa's, undergoing a lot of things, a lot of restructuring, right? Politically, socially, economically, etc., and dealing with a global pandemic, and a new variant that has subjugated South Africans from being banned from over 128 countries. So with the change right now in the Constitution, Chapter 25 specifically around this idea of land expropriation without compensation. So you have, these white farmers right now who are basically shivering, right, and who are now planning their exits to Australia and New Zealand and Canada and probably here in the US, probably in the South, I'm assuming, like Texas, etc., Alabama. And so you have Chapter 25 that's undergoing, and that's in the land expropriation, land reform question that's been undergoing since 1994, right? During the Sunset Clause, during Cardessa, when the late Nelson Mandela was negotiating with the apartheid government about now how do we, what's the land reform, what does the process look like, and there was all this kind of back and forth, and obviously neoliberal policies kind of came at, started basically manifesting itself through these negotiations. So you have people have been, one is that, so there's the land reform project that's a work in progress, but also the issue of urban housing, right? Within urban settlement, because the issue, and the other thing as well we have to think about, specifically in the case study of South Africa, is that the rural migration to urban settlements have been going on for the longest time, prior to the formation of 1910. And so right now, you have a backlog for housing, and you should have backyard dwellers and the housing assembly, for example, in South Africa. I think Dr. Joseph probably also knows about the work that the housing assembly is busy with. And so you have, a great re-emergence of like civil society, mobilizing themselves, rethinking the idea, through now do we dismantle this neoliberal pro-capitalist project, that's South Africa. And I think that speaks directly to the correlation of what's happening with kind of, the decolonial project that's undergoing throughout the continent of Africa. And I think there's links to the rest of the world. So I mean, in the context of my work, and now I'm thinking through all these issues and social political issues, is that, thinking also throughout new ways of how to present the work as well, right? Right now, I can no longer travel to film festivals, for example. So we're thinking of, obviously, one is, making it accessible in various ways and forms, through uploading it onto a kind of miniature file so that people can watch the film in Zambia. I mean, we were planning this road trip to go show the film in these different rural areas, and that obviously through COVID, when COVID-19 popped, obviously that plan kind of got thrown out of the window. So right now we're thinking, we kind of creatively thinking through the process. I mean, we do have, there's a lot of work that lives online. One is that we created a digital archive project. So coming back to the idea of archiving, for us, I mean, it's really critical that, for me, it's not about the end product really, it's about, just documenting the process, right? And really thinking through also in the context of the vision of third cinema, right? And that solidarity movement that came about through the use of filmmaking and cinema. And so now thinking through reinvigorating those solidarity movements, right? Through the use of cinema. So we have a project, for example, we launched a few months ago, and what's called the Digital Archive Project, Chronicles of Spatial Violence. And it lives on the internet. I could share some links. It's a 20-part episodic series. And it basically came out of Not in My Neighborhood, right? The film set between South Africa, Brazil, and the US. And so we have that we've been using, kind of excavating in our own personal archive, and then basically putting it online. And also, we were doing all these grassroots pop-up screenings, right? Taking our work through to farm workers in the Western Cape, farm workers in the Eastern Cape, and mobilizing in that spaces as well. So we have a feature film, for example, that kind of came out of that work, which spoke about the what's known as today as the Durian Uprising, where farm workers in 2013 basically rose up on a wine farm in the Western Cape and basically started burning these plantations down, right? And it was like this mass national, solidarity movement. And that came out to now become a feature-length script, right? A feature-length project. So yeah, I mean, I think the land question is always evident in whatever I'm thinking about, because that's so critical, right? Because yeah, again, land remembers, right? And we remember, and there's a critical, interconnection that we need to be conscious of, right? Of how we think through the idea around land reform, because I think South Africa is a classical case of maybe how not to do it, because clearly I think with the current discourse around the ANC and then neoliberal project, I don't think Ramaphosa, is gonna. I mean, I hope he's gonna follow through the project, but I'm not sure. I think right now he's dealing with, him, trying to be re-elected, so there's massive, contestation and two basic camps that exist within the ANC. So there's that internal issue. So I think the land question, and Chapter 25 specifically in the Constitution, is a work in progress. And radical, political change is critical right now. And I don't know if, like, the example is the EFF, for example, led by our great brother, Julius Malema. And so that's that. I mean, that was their. I mean, when they came into existence, land reform, land expropriation without compensation was their buying card, right? To basically vote, buy-in vote. So, but again, yeah, I mean, it's complex. South Africa, the world is a complex space,
Can I jump off some of those comments, Tasneem?
Yeah, no, sure. I wanted to also bring Savi back into the conversation.
Do that first.
As well. And then, I'm going to stack you, Yusuf, if that's okay. And, so I've read some articles and in our conversation, Savi, you've talked about, some of the major land justice issues that connect the North, the South, the urban and the rural. And I would say the local and the global is gentrification. And we've talked about even, last month in our film screening with Kurt's film, Not in Our Neighborhood, talking about gentrification as precision colonialism, right? So there's a lot of this sort of murkiness around the ways in which we talk about gentrification, but actually the conceptual language and how we think about what gentrification actually is. And you've been working on, you are on the forefront of these struggles. You've been working in Black farmers movements for the past 3 decades. And so I wanted to see if you could share some of your strategies and practices. I know that right now, collective ownership of land is a legal strategy that you implement in the work that you do. But can you talk more about, some of these strategies and practices that you're using? And really another sort of point that I want to make up is thinking about in an article, a co-authored article that you wrote in the Land Justice, which is an incredible book that I really suggest folks buy if you're very interested in land-based struggles, especially in the Americas. But thinking about this, Africana consciousness and cosmovision that's really filtered through this kinetic agrarian identity, and how we can sort of think more clearly about, and I keep on sort of coming back to this, but thinking about the role in which women play in as creators and in really founding these new societies, right? Who have to combine the labor of the land, the labor of birthing, the labor of kin, right? The labor of care for communities and families.
Well, in terms of our movement here on the land question, and we've been saying really that gentrification and land loss there's no separation. It's a function of racial capitalism, and so what we try to do is to bridge the gap. First of all, we see, and that's the tension that we hold, right? The land is at once our liberated zone, right? And so we see part of that liberated zone is the grounding that we have gotten in urban centers, and then it be removed by gentrification to rural places that are so polluted, because even the peri-urban places that we used to have farms, we have been pushed out. So so for me, that also links what I've seen in the encampments and the 10 cities in Oakland, and the liberatory spaces of African-American women, taking back homes that are vacant. And so I just see a lot of like linkages. So here in North Carolina, you had your first incorporated African-American town, Princeville. It was a land that nobody else wanted. That's why, Black folk were able to get it. And they worked for it, and they had to pay for it. It was not a giveaway. And, it's a land that is in a floodplain. But at the same time, there is a sense that, this is our home. This is now our ancestral home, and it's a space of liberation. So whenever there's this flooding and there's talk about moving a part of Princeville to higher elevation, that's a struggle, that's a tension that the African-American community holds. And I think that's also the tension around heirs property. That's kingship property. It's our family. It's our African village ecosystem, and we got it because of white supremacy, because we couldn't trust their legal processes. So there's all this talk, and Federal Reserve, they're looking at that. about the billions of dollars that African Americans are holding in capital that's tied up in heirs property. And if we were able to liberate that capital, then we could pay for homes, we can do housing, we could do, education. And there's that disconnect. And I think, there is an appreciation for the ancestral nature of it, but there is this thing that while this is the asset in your family, and it needs to be in a place where it's accessible. And I think that's, for me, yes and no. I think if it is housed in democratic structures that is like owned by the family, and there are some instruments like a limited liability corporation where you would deed in your interests in heirs property until you get to a majority and you manage it. But still the larger family would have access, and you're not pushing away and creating further class division. For me, I think always back to New Orleans after Katrina, when everybody finally realized that New Orleans was really one large African village, and it was heirs property that was the glue. And so there was no way to get on the way back home under bourgeois legality because you don't have title. And so there were some instruments that were created to sort of help with the situation. But at the end of the day, it has taught us as African-American urban dwellers and rural dwellers that we have to somewhat engage the system enough to have protective structures if we're going to continue to be here in places that we want to be. And we do have the right to the city. We have a right to stay and age in places, and we have a right to our agrarian culture, and we need the land. And that's why, for me, there's even a growing movement here in North Carolina around underutilized park systems and green spaces. We want to grow food, all right? And we want it in a very collective way. So for me, looking at more collective processes of holding land and less that absolute, that fee simple absolute might be a way forward here. And I think the question of land and its liberation will always be with us. And I think we can always remember Malcolm X in his message to the grassroots and the grounding of land within our consciousness and why it's important within living in this physical space. So yeah, but for me, Kurt, you made all the links. And I really wish I was a film person and could really talk about decoding it, because for me, it was the glue. So I saw that. Linking the African diaspora around the land question, I thought was brilliant. So thank you.
Absolutely. And Yusuf, I want to give you opportunity to sort of jump in and respond to Kurt, and just to think about, as we're closing, so it's almost 8:30, and I wanted to kind of just close our conversation. If folks, after Yusuf responds, has some closing remarks that they would love to share, please do so. And any questions from folks on the chat, please feel free to ask them.
Well, this will just be my closing remarks, and really building off of something that Savi mentioned earlier at the start in her remarks about the example of Zimbabwe as, both this horrific space where you see the disparities that are racialized disparities in access to land persisting into the present. And then thinking about how in the credits to Kurt's film, it seems like there was some funding or collaboration with the Sam Moyo Institute of Agrarian Studies. And that seemed to me so appropriate because Sam Moyo's work and his analysis of the land redistribution program in Zimbabwe seems particularly apt for this conversation, in the sense that it grappled with all of the intricacies and complexities in a really politically nuanced way, I thought, right? And so Kurt was talking about contemporary South Africa, where now the question of land redistribution is being pushed to the foreground by movements, right? And then taken over by kind of political parties. The ANC is being pushed. And thankfully, we have this more radical political party, EFF, really pushing them, right? But really movements already before either of them were talking about it, were bringing this question to the foreground in the same way that Kurt's film gives us a sense in Eswatini, Mozambique, and Zambia. And, you know, Sam Moyo, I believe, argued that the land redistribution program in Zimbabwe was really the only mass land redistribution, successful land redistribution that had occurred in the post-Cold War era. This time when we sanctified private property, where we were thought there was no more opportunity to redistribute land. But I thought his analysis achieved a kind of celebration of this, not by attributing the success to Mugabe's government. I believe his partner for many years was actually working for the opposition. And part of the things that coming back to Kurt's comments on the rural-urban divide, Mugabe's authority quite often came from rural traditional leaders. And so when it came to the urban land question, he engaged in massive displacements of shack communities through really authoritarian practices. So Moyo, nonetheless, in the face of a kind of international criticism of this land redistribution program, especially from South Africa, where, as Kurt said, all of the white entrenched land interests were horrified by this example, and therefore, you know, took recourse to denunciations of Mugabe as a tyrant, but for really instrumentalist reasons. Moyo argued, no, this was actually pushed from people from below, and Mugabe was forced, his hand was forced to kind of accede to it if he wanted to remain in power. So this was a victory of people's movements. And he also assessed whether or not this was productive in terms of its developmentalist effects. And Moyo said, this has mixed results, but by and large, right, about 10 years ago, he was arguing that it seemed to be improving people's ability to produce even more now that the land was redistributed. But he was careful to also not fall into this other side, which is a really celebratory that Mugabe is our great leader, that at times, you know, groups like the EFF point to and others, because, right, movements can suffer at the hands of these leaders one way or another. So the kind of focus on land redistribution from below, where movements are really pushing the agenda that I think the film accomplishes, that I think Savi's talking about, and the amazing work people have been doing in the United States, right, for a long time, really thinking about at the community level, how we can regain access to land. We know we've had the example of Jackson for a long time. I think is just so crucial. And the film, I think, really nicely points to that. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't highlight the really crucial role that Sam Moyo played in really helping us push this conversation about land redistribution forward in a really nuanced and politically savvy and radical way.
I appreciate that. Yeah. I will always miss him. He's dear to my heart. I learned a lot attending those sessions. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so just for a disclaimer as well. Yes, so in fact, the film was a collaboration. So Sam Moyo, African Institute for Agrarian Studies, basically approached me. They have, you know, they saw some of my previous work and we started collaborating, but there was a number of films that featured activists that actually works directly with them. And that's kind of how the partnership started through this film. And so it was an amazing collaboration. I was just learning more about Sam Moyo as well, you know, and his work.
Yes.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity, you know, to have engaged in this film and making this film.
I do want to plug the book that Duraja Press is publishing. It's coming out in April. We Rise
Oh,
for Our
yeah.
Land. Yeah.
Plugging time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's important. I was trying to get the book
Yes.
before.
Yeah.
And they're
In
like,
fact,
it's not
yeah.
published. Yeah. So it should be coming out in April. We Rise for Our Land, Land Struggles and State Repression in Southern Africa.
Yeah,
and
that's
it's co-published.
Oh, sorry, Tasneem. Yes, I was just going to mention, so the book will be, it's the Raja Press based in Canada, who's the publishing company. So the book is coming out in April, May. So I will definitely share information with Tasneem. And all the proceeds, for transparency, all the proceeds will be going back to the community and all the actors on the ground that's featured in the film. And also, I also just want to mention that the Pro Savannah case that's mentioned in the film, when we were shooting basically there was, which is the bilateral agreement between Brazil, Japan, and Mozambique. And for historical context, it was going to be the biggest land grab. We're talking about like 14 million hectares of land, and that project has been put on hold. That has been stopped because of the work of social movements on the ground in Mozambique. And so that, at least, there's a positive, right? And we have to build on this, the bit of wins that we gain, right? So yes, so there's the book that's coming out, which with the same title of the film, We Rise for Our Land. And yeah, so I will definitely forward information as soon as it's launched.
Thank you so much, Kurt. I invite James or Dr. Rashid or Savi, if you have any last kind of closing comments or remarks or questions that we can think about. And I appreciate, just this robust conversation. You guys are also really helping me think through, land-based movements and how we think about these, really the complexities and the contradictions in our organizing and our mobilization, how we conceptualize our the demands that we're making as well, and the type of new worlds that we are practicing and bringing into being to think about. And this is something that Dr. Pope and I talk about a lot, is like, what are we thinking out beyond struggle? What is the world that we're trying to create?
Well, my wish is that James will pull together some poetic riffs and I know you can do it.
We're waiting, James.
Yeah, I want to hear
I
some
was
rhymes.
so excited.
Okay.
Yeah, it ain't got to rhyme.
I thought I gave enough.
No.
No, I wanted to, give space to Dr. Rashid, because Dr. Rashid works in a space that really deals with an African world perspective on these particular questions that I think that needs to be centered in a lot of these things, a lot of these particular conversations. So I wanted to kind of, give Dr. Rashid some space if he would like to take some of that space. And then I was going to, I would leave like one particular comment, not necessarily a rhyme, but a comment, but a comment nonetheless.
What? I'll share this. So one of the things that we've been attempting to do with our small farm is to, because we are engaged in work in so many different domains, we've attempted to make the work on the farm and this conception of land as a site of as a key basis of self-determination, a central element in what we do. And that's manifested itself in two ways, which I think for us have been instructive, and I think have been instructive perhaps for people around us. And we're continuing to learn as we build this. One of the things that we did, which we did in the May of 2019, we couldn't do it in 2020, for obvious reasons. We did a planting ritual, and we had been talking about doing this because in our ancestors, there would be rituals around planting, there'd be rituals around the harvest, and so we did that, and it was a beautiful occasion because I was concerned about the extent to which, especially for our children, like for them to a large extent, this is toil. And I say that with no exact, like they see this as toil. And it's always this, there's always a desire to help them see the deeper meaning of this, the deepest significance and symbolism of this. And so we hopefully, I don't know if we'll be able to do that this year. I think we'll do it maybe guerrilla style. But the other thing is that, so we have a rites of passage group, a male rites of passage group that I help to coordinate, and young African-American boys ages 12 to 18. 12 to 18. And a year ago, well, 2 years ago now, we brought a group of them out there to work on the land. And we had conceived of this day where they would spend a certain amount of time working on the farm. They'd spend the rest of their time doing some training, some martial arts training. And so we're going to redo that this year. And the way it's going to play out this year is going to be a little more dynamic, where, and we haven't quite figured out the logistics of this. Is going to be interesting. So we're going to divide the time. Some of them are going to be farming and maybe doing some planting. I'm not sure yet. Another group is going to be learning about medicinal plants. We're fortunate that on the site, the group that runs the site that our incubator farm is on, they have a whole host of medicinal plants. And there's a brother, this is his area of study. So 1/3 of the brothers who won't be farming or working on the land, probably moving compost more than anything else, they'll be learning about these medicinal plants. And then the third group of brothers, they'll be off doing some martial arts training. One of the things that we're attempting to deal with this is this idea of how do we conceptualize self-determination for African people on as many levels as possible. That is, no people can strive to be self-determining unless they have the capacity to feed themselves. So that's one. On another level, however, and we're seeing this all around us, our health has been hijacked, not just by the corporate capitalist health system, but also by a food system which preys on our well-being. You shouldn't even call it a food system, but this food industry that preys upon our health and well-being. And so this idea of giving us knowledge and giving us the capacity to heal ourselves is also another element of this. And so we see this as another key building block in our striving towards self-determination. And then finally, the martial arts. And like for us, it's not about just kicking and punching. You know, when I'm training with them, we're doing African and African diaspora and fighting arts. And so we're trying to make these also things which are anchors to memory. And so for us, the farm hasn't just been, or the land hasn't been just been this thing that is an appendage to this work, or is on the periphery of this work. In fact, it's central to this. And part of why we've been attempting, especially through the ritual, as a way of enacting through some activity, this by creating this moment in space and time where people can understand the way in which this space is central, not only to how we sustain ourselves physically, but how we renew ourselves spiritually, and how we restore the fiber, the foundations of community. So again, appreciate that. And this is where we're still learning, we're still growing. This is we've been doing this since 2014, and we're looking to expand next year and to keep going. But I appreciate the opportunity to share. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rashid. The work that you're doing, like Dr. Pope said, is so important. And a little TMI, Dr. Rashid trains me in African martial arts as well. It's so important to transmit and to remember our collective memory and our practices and our traditions and our spiritual systems as well. And Dr. Pope, if you would like to offer some closing remarks, if not, that's great. That's totally okay. I do appreciate everyone for coming and sharing space with us tonight, for thinking, as we like to say, for thinking Black out loud, and for really thinking through a lot of these questions, a lot of our strategies and our tactics, how we're more effective and efficient in our organizing and our agitation. And again, for everyone, I mean, you know, I have a lot of students that stayed the whole time, and so I'm so happy. But it's important for them, because there's something that the sister said from the rural Southern African Assembly, and they said the future is in the hands of our younger folks, particularly younger women, and the sustainability of our movements is based on these intergenerational relationships, and is based on them remembering and constantly, and us providing constant guidance and remembrance for a new world, right? For a world that our ancestors fought for the world that we're fighting for, and the world that is always, you know, happening in the in-between spaces. So I appreciate everyone, your time, your space, your brilliance, and for sharing so much of your knowledge with us. So Ashe, please be safe, be peaceful, and take good care.
Thank you, guys. Nice to see you, brother Youssef.
Likewise.
Yeah.
See your face.
Yeah, man. Yeah, we'll be in touch really soon, because we definitely want to talk about, you know, your book and some of the other things from the last conversation that we had too. So
cool. Sounds good.
All right, we'll talk to you.
All right.
All right. Nice to see you, Attorney Horn. You wanted to hear my rhymes. You wanted to hear my rhymes.
Waiting. You notice?
Listen, I'm not a freestyle. I have to write. I don't freestyle. I write.
Okay, I hear you.
Thank you so
But-
much, Brother Kamal, too.
Yeah,
Oh,
brother.
thank you. Thank you. I
Yeah.
appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Thank you, Brother Rashid. I look forward to visiting the farm.
Yes, ma'am, definitely. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
thanks
you.
everyone. Thanks, James.
No problem. Louisa.
Thanks,
Sorry.
Louisa.
Great conversation.
Kamal, we'll be in touch
Yes,
for those other conversations. I just had to get some space. So
Yeah, for sure.
we'll
I
be in touch.
understand.
Okay. Okay.
I look forward to it very much. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. Cool, man. All right.
I appreciate
Thank you
all.
so much,
All
Savi, for coming through, too. I know you were
Yeah.
not feeling well tonight, so I appreciate
Yeah,
you so
I
much.
did my best. All right. Night.
All right, good night, everyone.
All right. Good night.